Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Rozier. I'm the director of the Albert Lepage Center for History and the Public Interest and a member of the Villanova History Department faculty. Welcome to the second Crisis Moments discussion of the fall semester and the final Lepage Center event of the semester. A special welcome to our distinguished guests, Dr. Ray Baker, Dr. Carl Gershenson, and Dr. Nancy Kwok, who will explore the crisis of housing, a topic of great importance in the recent New York City mayoral election, as well as in cities and countries across the globe. Before we begin, I want to thank the Lepage Center's Kevin Fox and Christina Stella for helping to organize tonight's event. And I want to encourage you to attend the Lepage Center events in the upcoming spring semester, which will include 2 more Crisis Moments events, as well as numerous Lunch at Lepage talks by faculty and students, as well as several panel discussions on popular culture topics such as the history of the sneaker and how history is represented in popular dramas such as The Gilded Age and other shows. Finally, I'll note that this event will be recorded and made available to watch at a later date. If you want to view this recording or our previous event recordings, you can find them on Villanova University's YouTube channel, which we'll link here in the chat. We're also on social media. You can follow us at LepageVU on Instagram and Blue Sky. And if you'd like email updates on our grant funding and event offerings, we've put the link to subscribe in the chat as well. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, my colleague, Dr. Anna Dunsing, who will then introduce our speakers in the order of their presentations. After their presentations, Dr. Dunsing will ask a few follow-up questions and then turn to your questions, which you can pose at any time in the Q&A function. Dr. Dunsing earned her PhD in history at Yale University and serves as assistant professor of history at Villanova University. She researches and teaches about the 20th century Black freedom struggle, transnational social movements, and the evolving global politics of white supremacy. Beyond her training and work in academia, she has held numerous positions at public history institutions, including 10 years as an educator and researcher at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City. Thank you, Dr. Dunsing.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rozier, and to everyone at Lepage for putting this panel together. I'm thrilled to be here, though I think there's a somberness in being here and getting to be a part of this conversation. As Dr. Rozier indicated, whether it's mounting headlines or, growing scholarship on the subject, people are thinking about the roofs over their heads. And I think, or lack thereof. And I hope this conversation can, maybe leave you with more questions than answers, but also give you some historical context, give you a sense of what can be done, what people are doing, and how we might imagine a future where the crisis of housing feels a bit less, where the house feels a little less on fire, I should say. So we welcome you all who are joining us. We welcome your thoughtful engagement and questions. And with that, I will introduce our speakers. So first, you'll be hearing from Dr. Ray Baker, who is an assistant professor, policy practitioner, critical geographer, and organizer within Movements for Housing Justice and Transformative Community Safety. Their scholarly and policy work addresses race, racism, and property relations through action-oriented investigations of urban land use, tenant and property rights, and public agency uses of artificial intelligence surveillance technologies. Then we'll have Carl Gershenson, who is lab director at Eviction Lab. He has published on the causes and consequences of housing instability with a special focus on how eviction leads to further economic and residential insecurity. He received his PhD in sociology from Harvard University, where his dissertation explored the political and cultural origins of the American Business Corporation. After graduation, Carl joined the sociology department at Washington University in St. Louis as a postdoctoral research fellow. And then lastly, you'll hear from Nancy Kwok, who is an associate professor in the history department and the urban studies and planning department at UC San Diego. Her first book, A World of Homeowners, American Power and the Politics of Housing Aid, was awarded book prizes by the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations and the Urban History Association. She's also published numerous articles in a co-edited volume called Making Cities Global. She is currently a non-resident fellow at Carnegie, California. And as a way to get things started, given the breadth and depth of your collective expertise, the question I have is really as a way of introducing yourselves, your current research or your broader expertise and your day-to-day work, what does the housing crisis mean to you? And perhaps that's sort of right now or most immediately, but what do you want to talk about in talking about the housing crisis? And how should we, I think as a separate question, perhaps, how should we think about the housing crisis as a historical condition, right? Describing past phenomena versus as a persistent problem over time, versus as a contemporary emergency. So, Ray, please get us started. Thank you so much.
Oh, we'll go in order. Okay. Well, my as a geographer rather than a historian, my initial thought on this is to think back to the idea of the housing question. And if the housing question is something that has always been connected deeply to the conditions of workers, the conditions that workers need in order to be productive, and whether or not workers can afford the housing that they need in the places they need to be in order to be productive for someone else's benefit. I think about the housing question today in relation to the changing economy and a turn toward artificial intelligence in our economy, a turn toward the deepening financialization of housing in the economy that we live in today, and how people will continue to struggle against that. To me, housing justice is a question of freedom. It is, of course, a question of rights. Housing is not a right in all places in the world. And often when we are in housing justice spaces amongst activists, people talk about the right to housing, which is something we are still actively fighting for. And I think because housing is not yet a right, the struggle for housing justice is really a question about freedom.
I mean, I'm gonna, I guess, scoop a lot of what I'm going to eventually talk about in my presentation. But, as a sociologist, we do a lot of quantitative work figuring out who in the population is the housing crisis impacting the most and what are the long-term consequences of the housing crisis. And again, previewing what I'll be talking about, the housing crisis is affecting families, young families, and children more than anyone else. And we also have a lot of research about the very detrimental long-term consequences that things like poverty and housing stability have for children and young adults. So when I think about the housing crisis, I'm not just thinking about the acute pain that many people are experiencing right now, but I think about what are the generational consequences that we are going to see from the severity of what a child born today, what they're going to experience over the rest of the century.
Following in the footsteps of Ray and Carl, what the housing crisis is for me, well, I think one of the temptations when we talk about the housing crisis is to think of it as a really recent phenomenon, or at best, like last half century kind of phenomenon. And as the historian in the group, I feel it is my duty to argue for a slightly longer time frame in understanding what housing crisis means. Certainly there are 20th century dimensions and 21st century, obviously, dimensions to the housing crisis that we're struggling with today. And in particular, and here, like Carl, I'll kind of scoop some of my later comments, but certainly one of the big issues is the way that housing has been transformed from a housing need into housing as investment. And that's a really powerful transformation that I think shapes our current housing crisis. But I also think there are racial dimensions, class dimensions that sweep all the way through American history and certainly global history, although I know that's not what we're talking about today. And these connective tissues, I hope I'll be able to talk a little bit more about.
Okay, thank you for easing us in. So with that, continuing in the same order, should we shift to your more prepared remarks, and then I'll get you off the cuff again. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for the introduction. I have just some brief ways of introducing myself as well. So my name is Prof. Ray Baker, and I had this said about me already. I'm an assistant professor. I'm a geographer, and I work in a program that's called Education and Community Action Research. Being a geographer and a critical geographer, what that means about me is that I have a very critical approach and critical research paradigm that tends to prioritize the immediacy of the actions that need to be taken in order to uphold human dignity and to change and improve the material conditions and economic conditions, the way we think about race, the way we think about political marginalization and community marginalization, and to find and collaborate with people on the front lines of these struggles. That's how I approach my work as a critical geographer. I was excited to receive the invitation to speak at tonight's event, especially after reading the mission of the Albert Lepage Center, particularly that the center's mission is to offer space for historically informed conversations about how the past shapes the present, as well as the center's priority to partner with public institutions and journalists and scholars to promote history in the public interest. Some commonalities across my research and the mission of the Lepage Center include an understanding that scholarship can be conducted in the public interest through collaboration, and that history matters. Despite what kind of messaging has been churning over the last, approximately 10 months in this fever dream timeline, the collecting of history and its protection and analysis and truth-telling are of undeniable importance, and history is, after all, about telling the truth. So I'm here tonight to speak as someone who has long been engaged in different kinds of housing struggles through a variety of outlets. Most immediately is the material realm as a housing activist and as a tenant organizer. I've worked in tenant organizing and housing activist spaces through ACORN, as well as a number of sort of local and community level tenant organizing initiatives. And during 2020, I worked as a director at a housing nonprofit in Detroit that was responsible for distributing COVID-19 emergency rental assistance funds. Some of you may be familiar with that, the SERA funds that were released by the White House. So my work as an academic is informed by all of this and by being witness to generational harms of housing loss and eviction, tax foreclosure, and the impact of my own family's history of housing insecurity and occasional homelessness. Most of this work for me has been informed by housing activism in Detroit, Michigan, where I live and work and have for the last approximately 15 years, which means witnessing the mortgage foreclosure crisis, witnessing the tax foreclosure crisis, and also witnessing and being very much part of the potential eviction crisis that we were facing as part of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I have a project to share with you all tonight that began in December of 2019. But December of 2019 means that the project quickly evolved into something else by March of 2020. So myself and my co-editor, whose name is Alex Farrar at UCLA, assembled an edited volume. It's right here, and I'll tell you the title of it. This edited volume is something that we think of as a living archive that consolidated the experiences of tenant organizers, legal aid workers, tenants, activist scholars, and policy practitioners who were on the front lines of housing justice and eviction defense work at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. We deeply knew the urgency of assembling a project of this kind because of the memory of 2008 and 2009, when the foreclosure crisis rolled through, and our memories of 2013 to 16, when the tax foreclosure shockwave hit housing activists, particularly in Detroit, that had two back-to-back national record-setting years of tax foreclosure crises. We knew that housing justice activists had to look to our elders in 2020 to know how it was we would respond to this particular moment in history. However, in 2020 and 2021, we were not sure exactly how to approach housing activism and housing justice work because we had never done this work during a pandemic. Financial crises, sure. Banking, mortgage, tax foreclosure crises, sure. but we'd never experienced doing housing justice work in the period of time of the pandemic. So the particular circumstances in which pandemic housing justice work was taking place was, as we recall, not something many of us had experience with. The need for social distancing and ensuring that physically and medically vulnerable people were not going to be compromised when accessing the supports that they needed. And in the early days, not knowing how to interact without potentially transmitting a respiratory virus. There's lots of important histories written by AIDS and HIV activists about doing organizing during a time of an sort of unknown bloodborne transmission. But when it came to respiratory viruses, we were sort of coming up short. We knew very little about how to organize during that period of time. So in the spirit of engaging with the state of crisis that we were in, knowing that there's always another crisis to prepare for in the future, this particular book, which is called Dispatches from the Threshold, Tenant Power in Times of Crisis, was envisioned. And organizing the project was swiftly underway. That started in about October of 2020. So this edited volume contains chapters from 17 different cities, as well as 5 different countries. And to ensure that making use of the crisis that was happening was something that we were doing in preparation for the next crisis and potentially the next pandemic, we asked the contributors to this project to think about the immediate barriers to housing access they were encountering on the front lines that felt elevated or circumstantial or escalated in 2020 and 2021 because of the pandemic conditions. And while personal and community health was an obvious theme across these chapters, I have a few other recurring themes that I'd like to point out because they're important to think about as we move through our work as people who do housing justice work or housing justice scholarship today, as well as people who probably have an eye on the horizon of the days, months, and years, definitely days, ahead, and what those hold for a more housed and more justly housed future. So the first theme is the role of police and policing, specifically police interactions with tenants and within landlord-tenant relations, police intervention in non-court ordered evictions, and initiating and aiding and abetting extra-legal evictions through collusion with landlords is something that is present throughout this book from across these 17 different cities that are represented in the book. That also unfortunately includes the shootings and murders of a number of tenants by police in non-court ordered extra-legal evictions. The second is the role of race and racial discrimination and housing inequality and how heavily that weighs throughout the text. It's something that cannot be separated from this first point about policing and police interactions. Black and communities of color experienced higher rates of eviction during the peak acknowledged years of the pandemic, more than any other population. And the contributions of this volume also, the contributors to this volume also acknowledge that people who were living in encampments during 2020 and 2021 were also predominantly Black and people of color. And we need to think about things like racialized dispossession and histories of generational housing loss in relation to those ways of noticing who's being most impacted, not only by a pandemic, not only by movements against police brutality that were happening at the same time, and not only by eviction housing loss because of loss of work and inability to work due to illness. People of color are dramatically overrepresented across the board. And third is the relationship between an abolitionist politics and the role of settler colonial property relations, and how critical understandings of settler colonial logics of property coalesce around a politics of rights to housing, rights to ancestral lands, and the necessity to conduct housing justice and eviction defense work in ways that also acknowledge histories of Indigenous removal, attempts at cultural erasure through mass death, and the realities of legal frameworks of treaties and land agreements that still exist today, but that exist within a mindset of settler refusal. If we use history to prepare for the future, some conditions to watch out for include threats of funding cuts against Section 8 housing vouchers, and what ongoing governmental shutdowns and the framing of basic necessities as so-called entitlements by government officials does to the people who need those services. as well as the possibility that there will be disciplinary access requirements for housing, not dissimilar from workfare programs being demanded of those who are most in need of housing. We also have to think about what challenges artificial intelligence present to movements for housing justice and access, as well as the mass commodification of our personal data, including household utility data, which I almost guarantee everyone who's watching today, your household utility data is purchased and shared. You might not even know that that's happening, but it is. And the kind of challenges that these forms of technology and sharing of data, purchasing of data, not sharing, purchasing of data, present to housing security. How can people facing not only housing insecurity, but potentially compounded gaps in access to internet and technology respond to whatever kind of challenges AI presents to us, not necessarily today, but in the fast approaching future? So I will leave my comments there, and thank you for the moments to speak. And yeah, happy to answer any questions folks might have after our next two presenters. Will be great.
And Carl, would you like to take it up?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, do we see my opening slide? All right. Thank you everyone for inviting me here. Always fun to talk to a different kind of audience than I normally do. I love historians. I wish I got to do more history in my day-to-day. So very excited to hear what my co-panelists have to say. Very excited to get to the Q&As. I am the director of the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. We are a research center, #1 dedicated to creating the first national database of eviction filings in the United States. You think about everything that the federal government measures, it's a lot of things. It's a lot of things. No one is measuring how many Americans are getting kicked out of their homes each year. So we were created first and foremost to do that, also to be sort of a center researching the causes and consequences of eviction. Now, normally my presentations just focus all on eviction, but given that the prompt tonight was, is there a housing crisis? I thought this was sort of a fun opportunity to think more broadly about that question. So are we in a housing crisis? First question you have to ask is, for whom? And let's start with some good news. If I can, there we go. Homeowners are not in a crisis. This is a chart of home equity in real estate in the United States from 2000 to the present. And you can see that after this, the Great Recession just looks like a blip here in the accrual of home equity. And then we've been on a tear since 2012. There's now about $36 trillion of home equity in the United States. And if you were to average that, calculate that per individual, that's $100,000 per American. So there's a lot of wealth in real estate out there in the United States. Maybe you've heard that taxes, insurance payments, cost of living are going up. So maybe homeowners are struggling in some way to make their mortgage payments. But that is not the case. I'm speaking broadly, incidentally. But if we're looking at national statistics, homeowners are not in crisis as measured by the amount of foreclosures. If you look at the right tail of this graph here, you see that current foreclosure rates are below pre-pandemic lows. Right? We see the great financial crisis right here. And you see that even like before the financial crisis, foreclosure rates were much higher than they were afterwards. Credit standards have really been tightened in the United States. So these days, if you're given a mortgage, most people are able to make their payments. So again, it is a great time to be a homeowner. What is the flip side here? Well, of course, it's been getting harder and harder to become a homeowner. Young adult homeownership, in fact, peaked in 1980 and has been on a long-term secular decline ever since then. Right, looking at this graph, we see that after World War II, there are all sorts of very muscular federal policies put in place. About 50% of young people were able to own the homes that they lived in, and that has just been going down and down. As much as we still culturally associate parenthood with home ownership, most people in the prime years for childbirth are in fact renters. And recently, it's become even harder to own a home. This graph, this gray line, is median household income over time from 2000 to the present. The green line is the income needed to buy the median home in the United States. So for much of the millennium, we were bopping around at about you need $60,000 in order to purchase the median home. During the pandemic, that number doubled to $120,000. So you now need $120,000 to buy the median house. That means that a majority of households are locked out of buying a home. How are Americans reacting to this? One thing that you do when you can't buy a home is you don't form a new household. So we are forming fewer households than we have been in the past. This graph is a graph, on the x-axis we have age groups. On the y-axis we have headship rates. Headship is the fraction of the population that is heading a household. So what we see here is that in 2000, that's the blue bar, about 28% of 20 to 24-year-olds were heading their own households. In 2019, it was only 20%. Notice that across every age group, this green bar is lower than the blue bar. But the difference is especially notable for young adults in their 20s, and you kind of see it for older adults too. This means that conditional on your age, we're pretty much all living in more crowded living conditions than we would have been in 2000. So one response to rising cost of home ownership, crowding into fewer homes. The other response, of course, is to remain a renter for longer. So let's check in on how renters are doing. Well, renters' incomes have not caught up to rising housing costs. This is a chart looking at how rents and renter incomes have changed since 2000. We see that renter incomes have increased by about 5% over the millennium, whereas rents have increased by 23%. That is obviously going to be a painful situation for all sorts of renter households, but is going to be most painful for low-income renters. We have another graph here looking at changes in residual income since 2000. Residual income is how much money do you have left over after paying your monthly rent. If we look at this orange line here, this is households earning $30,000 to $75,000. They've seen a slight deterioration in residual income. It's down 10% since the beginning of the millennium. But if we look at low-income households, those that are earning $30,000 and under, it is getting bad. It was getting bad, about 20% lower than it was in 2000. Then the pandemic hits, massive deterioration in residual income, more than 50% less residual income than in 2000. Most low-income renters have $250 left over at the end of the month after paying the rent. That's $250 for food, transportation, clothing, medical expenses. Obviously, these are not families that are able to have savings to prepare themselves for an unexpected income shock, like loss of job or medical emergency, car breaking down, or whatever. These are all families that are all on the brink of eviction at any time. So this is why we see 7.6 million individuals in the United States threatened with an eviction filing each year. And as it turns out, approximately 40% of those evicted are children. This age pyramid right here from Eviction Lab analysis. On the x-axis, we have eviction filing rates. On the y-axis, we have age groups. On the left, we have filing rates for females. On the right, we have filing rates for males. You see it's a fat bottoms pyramid. Again, this is showing that the time in your life when you are most likely to experience an eviction is when you are a child, ages 0 to 20. You also see that this pyramid is slightly asymmetrical. It bulges out more for women than men, not coincidentally, in the ages when you are most likely to have a child in your household. So who's getting evicted? It's children and their guardians. Another way we can look at the relationship between eviction risk and children. This is eviction risk by number of children in your household. So on the x-axis, we have age. On the y-axis, we have eviction filing rate. And each of these lines represents the number of children in your household. Every child you add increases your risk of eviction, right? If you have one kid, you have a little bit less than half of the risk of an eviction of someone who has 5 or more kids. But there's something else that's notable here, and that is this left tail. We see an uptick in eviction risk at the age we are calling -1. These are in utero evictions. So in fact, in your entire life cycle, the time when you're most likely to be evicted is when you are in utero. So this suggests extreme discrimination against pregnant women in the rental market, in the labor market, or both. Now, One other dimension that we have to talk about here is race. 18% of renters in this country are Black, but 50% of evictions are filed against a Black renter. When we intersect race and the presence of children in the household, we get some staggering statistics. You look at this bar in the middle, we estimate that Black households with children in them, about 25% experience an eviction filing in any given year, as compared to 15% of Black households without children. But of course, I mean, you see that these bars are much taller than all the bars around them. Even Black households without children still experience eviction at much higher rates than any other racial group in the United States. And the most acute manifestation of the housing crisis is homelessness. And homelessness follows housing costs. Here we are looking at scatter plots of, on the x-axis, we have median rent in cities and in counties. On the y-axis, we have homelessness rates. And this is showing a really tight relationship that as housing becomes more expensive in your city, in your county, in your metro area, rates of homelessness go up. So there is a lot at stake in terms of all of these affordability trends that we're seeing. So to summarize this presentation, is there a housing crisis? My answer is yes, and it is primarily hitting American renters during their prime child rearing years. The consequences of this are enormous because in American society, we use real estate or the access to real estate to apportion access to public goods like education, job opportunities. We know those are very unevenly distributed. Health, in terms of environmental hazards and pollution, safety in terms of access, safety from violence, safety from climate risk, and also retirement security, right? A lot of middle income and working class Americans, most of their wealth is in their real estate. Real estate, everything is conditioned on access to real estate, right? And I think that if you look at a lot of the figures I showed you, COVID exaggerated existing affordability trends. Nothing was trending in a good direction before COVID. But some of the affordability shocks in the post-COVID era were so severe, I think it represents a discontinuity in the kind of housing regime we're living in. And the social consequences for the cohort of families that are forming now, who are locked out of ownership, opportunity, and maybe even housing stability, they're going to play out over the next generation. I think ideally we disrupt these trends, right? Allow everyone access to ownership, opportunity, stability, and so forth. If not, we really have to consider that we might be moving into an era where there might be something almost caste-like about people's relationship to home ownership, which I don't know what the historians will say. That strikes me as different from where we've been before. I mostly focus on the 21st century, so I'll stop there and turn it over to my co-panelists.
And yeah, thank you so much, Nancy Kwok. You're all set up.
Sorry, I'm a little rusty with the Zoom. All right. So I'm really glad to be here as well. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with my co-panelists. And, one of the luxuries of being last is that you don't necessarily have to say everything again. So I'll cut out the parts that are a bit repetitive with what some of my co-panelists have said. But, I start this talk by addressing the central question that Anna gave us, which is there a housing crisis? And I thought a lot about which image to use on this first slide, because the typical format for thinking about housing crisis is to talk about people who are disenfranchised in some way or who are struggling to meet their needs in the housing system that we have today. But I would start this talk by saying that this kind of housing is absolutely part of our housing crisis. This is a house that's for sale just down the street from where I'm sitting in the University of California, San Diego. This is in La Jolla, a formerly redlined area, $108 million house with 10 bedrooms and 17 baths, going for, again, $108 million if you're looking for a McMansion to occupy. And the reason why I start with this is because our housing crisis is not just about working people not being able to afford housing, but it's about thinking really deeply about the kinds of inequitable growth that have happened over the course of this country's history. So just to introduce myself a little bit and who I am, I'm a historian. I've looked at the history of housing in the 20th century, and most of my research actually focuses on the post-World War II period and the Cold War period, when a lot of housing as we know it today, the sort of middle class suburban explosion happens. I'm interested in thinking about housing at the global scale. And again, I look at the sort of Cold War implications of American housing for places around the world. I won't talk about those today, but I love that Ray started with this nod to Manchester and to some of the industrial problems that occurred in England, and obviously were used as a jumping off point to talk about worker housing. I will say that the part that I do think connects with some of our task here in this panel is that I'm really interested in how we as a public, a general American public, form stories and shape questions about what equal access to housing means, what segregation means, what this history means to thinking about policy today. And so one of the projects that I recently completed was with the San Diego History Center, where is a museum in Balboa Park in San Diego, talking about the lost neighborhoods of San Diego, and really thinking more deeply about what it means to live in a city that is absolutely built on many, many stages of housing inequality. So thinking a little bit about what I mentioned in the beginning, which is this sort of longer arc of housing crises. As a historian, I would say the housing crisis today is simply the most recent manifestation or iteration of a long process of series of decisions by private industries and government actors, often working together to build housing into a tool of investment rather than as a basic human need. And the human crises, and the housing crises of this country have always had explicitly racial dimensions to them. So for instance, if we want to talk about thinking about native housing crises through land displacement, really beginning from the origins of settler colonialism, to looking at violent urban evictions, for instance, in the 19th century. Here I'm thinking about the evictions of Asian residents in urban dwellings over the course of the late 19th century, or the rise of tenements and industrial slums in the late 19th and early 20th century. These are all housing crises. They were perceived as housing crises in the moment. They were sources of real consternation on the parts of the ruling political leaders. Ghettoization and racial zoning and covenants, of course, have really deep roots in American history. Racial zoning, after it is made illegal, essentially after 1917, is quickly replaced by a system of covenanting that we still live with today. The growth of Hoovervilles in the wake of the stock market crash in 1929 and the explosion of self-built housing on the fringes and also interspersed in American cities is absolutely part of this story of inadequate housing for people who are not on the top tier of our class system. Post-1945 housing shortages are perhaps the most well-known out of this long litany of history. And this is, of course, the explosion of the baby boomers and the growth of the suburbs that was absolutely perceived as a housing crisis worthy of federal address. This ultimately culminates in growing unaffordability, especially after 1970. And I'll talk about this again in a minute, but the kind of policies that emerge to address the crises after World War II are not solutions that reach everybody and that are explicitly meant to not reach everybody. It is not an accident that some people continue to have housing crisis and experience housing crisis all through this moment of plenty and of ostensible prosperity. Of course, the part that we know the best is the part that we've lived through, which is the recession and the pandemic. But again, all very much part of this long story that is really intertwined with American history and can be seen in every period of housing history in this country. So if we think about the most recent housing crisis, I think it puts into perspective the way we understand, for instance, the rising number of rent-burdened or severely rent-burdened households. And usually we talk about the housing crisis in these sort of three pieces. We talk about it in terms of the rental market, and then the home ownership rates, and then we talk about it in the sort of extreme forms of houselessness, and the crisis of sheltered and unsheltered houselessness that we're seeing in our cities and in our suburbs, and that are growing at the national rate and in states as well, obviously. Just really quickly, I think that Carl already talked about this, so I won't talk too much, but here in this graph, you can see the sort of rates of rent burden or cost burden, the people who are spending more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. And you can see that line continues to, rise. And then of course, the bottom number, which is severely rent burdened, which is spending more than 50% of household income. So again, these trend lines are concerning and certainly marking a particular kind of housing crisis or particular flavor of housing crisis. Here looking at this is obviously a very well-known graph of homeownership rates in the United States historically. And of course, historically, the largest jump in homeownership rates happens in the wake of World War II from 1947 until 1960, and is very much the sort of product of the kind of housing reforms that were put into place by federal legislation in the Great Depression. And then, of course, it's kind of frozen during the Depression and World War II, and it takes off right after World War II. You don't see that being replicated anywhere else in terms of dramatic increases in homeownership. This is broken out by race. All races are seeing increases, but it's pretty clear the homeownership success story is a white story in this country. And the sort of aftermath of this big jump from 1950 to 1970 is that thereafter, what we're looking at is really the kind of intergenerational wealth impacts that we're seeing today from that big leap right after World War II. So how have we tried to address these most recent housing crises? Again, there's so many policies, programs, laws that I tried to figure out a way to organize this in clusters. And certainly one way is to think about the sort of government strategies to address these problems. And again, they fall into those three categories: rental, homeownership, and then the last, of course, is for people who are houseless. And there are a series of different programs that have come out over the past couple decades: rental assistance, an emphasis on increasing housing as supply. And there are some various specifics that I've listed here for those of you who want to kind of look up more. There's also assisted homeownership programs, including down payment assistance and specific targeted programs for first-time owners, as well as the government strategies around building a stronger safety net, including thinking again about what public housing means in our society. We don't really talk about public housing anymore. Somewhere it fell off the map. And when we do talk about public housing, it's often wrapped up in these homeownership campaigns. But certainly public housing is still a really important part of the way we can think about federal provision, and also city provision and state provision. And then, of course, there are grassroots strategies, which I think Ray can speak to more than me. This is Carl's wheelhouse. Looking back now, I'm like, Carl and Ray. So I won't speak too much about them, as I think we have two experts here, but certainly grassroots strategies, thinking through just cause evictions, rent control, limited equity co-ops, land trusts as strategies for trying to decommodify housing to some degree, and right to stay and anti-gentrification campaigns. And all of these are these attempts to try to address the most housing crisis at the level of policy and at the level of micro or community action. I will also say, as a Californian, that there's a lot to say about all of these moving parts, but looking forward, it seems that all of the housing crises that we're thinking about will be overshadowed, at least in California, by the connection between housing and exposure to climate crisis and the risks that come with climate crisis. For instance, heat exposure, fire risk, air pollution, freeway and airplane sound exposure. These are all deeply and fundamentally connected to housing and to the kinds of systems of segregated housing that we've developed in California. So I will say that the question I like the most, for those of you just listening in, we were given a series of really wonderful questions by Anna. And the one that I really liked the most was, given how diverse all of our housing crises are, how can we imagine a housing justice movement or housing policy that addressed these groups not as separate interests, but as part of a shared housing ecosystem. And this really resonates for me both in my research and also as an educator. This is the question my students ask all the time is, how do we make sense of all of this beyond the sort of micro policy level tweaking? How can we think differently about what we're doing with housing? And I would say that there's a really simple metric we can use to assess our housing crisis across time and location. And that is to think about the relationship between housing cost and housing benefit. How much has that housing cost and how much has it benefited the person living in it? How do we measure what we put in versus what we get out of our housing? And is it equitable across communities and households? And if not, then how can we move towards specific policies that address that inequality? Now, I would say that looking at this sort of macro level picture, it's really important to think once again about what these overarching problems teach us. So here again, I return to this slide that I raised earlier. Oh, and I didn't tell you what you're looking at in the slide. This image here is of Japanese Americans living in a hostel after World War II, very overcrowded in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. This is of one of the 3 communities in Chavez Ravine before it was cleared to make room for the LA Dodgers. And this is people who are living in self-built housing in San Fernando Valley right after World War II as well. So thinking about the long arc of housing crisis and what has worked and what has not worked over time. People often want historians to provide some sort of toolkit or what have we learned and how can you apply it? And unfortunately, it's messier than that, and it's difficult to extract a single tool. But I will say that looking at these longer housing crises, it's interesting to note which ones did get addressed and which ones were not addressed. And the ones that were addressed were the ones that ended up really supporting and building the white middle class as we know it today. And I've put in red the ones that I think the federal government and local governments really made a concerted effort to address. And then I left in black the ones that I think persist with us today. And so one of the questions I like to ask my students is, where do you think our housing crisis needs to begin in terms of being addressed? And I put up a bunch of different possibilities or choices. We need to increase how many houses we build. We need to think about housing price, et cetera, et cetera. And always consistently, without fail, my students choose this answer, which is they say the overarching problem of housing is one of political will and of mobilizing political will. And I think that's really instructive. And in terms of thinking about what we bring as researchers, what does it mean to mobilize political will to address these larger problems of housing? And I would say that it begins by valuing memory and connecting the long histories of struggle with the current moment. It also begins by building a more inclusive politics of housing justice, one that considers not just median numbers, but also thinks very deliberately about specific people who are not part of the majority. And finally, to think very deliberately about how others in the past mobilized a collective political will that did not build its momentum through exclusion. So I'll stop my comments there.
Thank you so much. And I think as we let our audience perhaps digest a little, I guess a few different ways forward. So one, I welcome, all the speakers to perhaps respond to one another. Obviously, there was a lot of overlap and I heard lots of sort of rhymes and echoes in what you were sharing. So if you feel moved, by all means, but maybe we could turn that question out to everybody. And maybe another way to think about it. So the question of how do we see these diverse intersecting, but oftentimes quite distinct crises as part of a shared ecosystem. But similarly, I find myself sort of before this, but definitely as I'm listening to you all, preoccupied with the question of, for lack of a better word, geography, right, and scale, and in what ways, right, especially, whether it's like grassroots organizing or policy, or studying trends or historicizing trends, what is what are the benefits of working at the hyper-local level, working in a neighborhood, working in a building, right? Versus thinking about national policy, and how can we recognize, right, that different areas of the country are impacted by the climate crisis differently. So I guess I'm thinking, right, this one, how can we sort of see a constellation and address, right, crises writ large? To what extent is that important versus working at these much smaller scales where you're often, right, working with individuals or individual communities?
Yeah, my initial thought on that is that those things are completely intertwined and are direct reflections of one another. And when you're pulling someone's belongings out of an eviction dumpster, it's the consequence of a policy that's either functioning at the level of the state as in not black box state, big state, but the state of Michigan, the state of Ohio, whatever, or much larger than that at the federal level. And when we try to imagine those things as being separate, it can put local level organizing in this silo of feeling as though you're sort of operating because of the conditions of the city that you are in, or because there's a high population of poor families in the city, low-waged households in the city, households led by Black women in the city, and that's actually the issue. And therefore, it's just an issue of race or of having a low income. And that's simply not a productive or I think responsible way of sort of constellating the larger net that comprises housing crises in people's lives. And I thought more about the question of, is there a housing crisis? And with one response we heard tonight was no, not for homeowners. Another is actually housing crisis is a history. And my thinking is that of course there is. And of course there's housing crisis as long as housing is thought of as a commodity. Of course there's housing crisis when we exclude homeowners from thinking about housing crisis, when we only think about tenants as being people who rent and not tenants as people who don't have financial control over their homes. People who pay mortgages don't have financial control over their homes. People who live in shelters don't have financial control over their housing. People who live in encampments don't have control over their housing. Those people comprise the population of people who are tenants, who have a shared interest in ensuring that there are stronger rights for tenants everywhere. So is there a housing crisis? Yes. Is it for everyone? If you don't own your housing, absolutely. And who does that include? It includes everyone who doesn't own their housing, including people who pay mortgages. And I think, if we look back only 10 years, we have, oh no, sorry, time is ticking, not 10 years, 15 years. We know that can be true at different moments in history. And if you are operating within a housing bubble, like the province of Ontario in Canada, like the province of British Columbia, like other parts of the world, or places where housing has been deeply, deeply commodified and turned into, assets for vacations, these vacation economies, like in Spain, you're dealing sort of outside of what might be familiar to you in the United States, but with contexts that indicate that there is mass housing crisis. And saying anything but that, I think, is a potential missed opportunity to really engage people in the important work of looking at how deeply connected everyone's housing situation really is.
And I guess to get to the answer about, what can be done at the local level versus larger political organization. I mean, I think that a lot of the best mutual aid, direct aid, civil, legal aid happens locally. But a lot of the needed housing reforms have to take place at a larger level. One, simply because the money is at larger levels, like the federal government has all the money, and we really need that both to subsidize demand directly, also to subsidize housing production, but also because there are, I think, real dysfunctions that happen when too much of housing politics or any kind of politics becomes too localized. Because we exist in a highly segregated society, if every city in a metro area is going to have very distinct political desires, and sometimes you need someone to step in and stop that. So, I suppose this talk is happening in Pennsylvania. So across the Delaware River in New Jersey, we've had for a long time a state Supreme Court ruling that created fair share requirements for affordable housing, requiring that every city in the state provide a certain amount of affordable housing, right? That's something that does not exist on the Pennsylvania side, allowing wealthier communities to try to block the development of affordable housing. So there are certainly times when I can romanticize local organizing, but other times when I think that is where a lot of our worst impulses actually live.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I like the whole framing of, is it local, is it national, where do we scale this? It's such an important question for thinking about change. And I do agree that the local has its limits, certainly financial limits, but what I think I would say about local is slightly different from what you said, Carl, in that more than just allowing for the expression of local needs that are sometimes short-sighted, which, certainly that happens. Absolutely, that happens. But more concerning, I think, is the fact that local organization often does not address really core inequalities that exist. So for instance, when you talk about new housing construction in California, which is such a hot kind of issue right now in terms of thinking about how Gavin Newsom is framing this, or how we're thinking about the solution to affordability through the production of housing, which is true. We're just not producing enough housing. We're at like half the pace that we need to be producing. But where is that new housing coming into existence? It's happening in some of the denser, older urban parts of the cities that in California. It's also happening more inland as opposed to in the coastal, very wealthy areas of California, which, by the way, have far less risk to a lot of these climate change factors that I've highlighted already. So thinking locally is really important, but it's not sufficient on its own, in the same way that the top-down kind of thinking doesn't often prioritize. This is like that's the most milquetoast way of saying it. In fact, the federal government has actually exacerbated, created, and otherwise, perpetuated the kinds of inequalities that we're trying to cope with now. So I guess it is both, and yet also thinking a little bit more about moments of change instead of thinking about local and national in the sort of policy realm. If we thought about it in terms of political organization and how we become active citizens engaged in questions of housing, and how we become aware of how all of these pieces fit together, then it seems really instrumental to begin at the local level and to start to begin the process of education and understanding there, in which case the two are synthesized beautifully.
Thank you all. So I'm not seeing any questions from the audience yet, so we still welcome those. But I think perhaps this is another question that has preoccupied me quite a bit, taken up a lot of space in my mind. And maybe I can sort of ask a contemporary and a more historical version of it. But I do really want to understand more like what happened surrounding the pandemic. Like what are just, I mean, I just sort of, in so many respects, I feel something like broke in this terrible way that we're only seeing the murmurs of sort of 2020, 2021, and after. So I'm wondering if any of you, maybe the bigger version of it is how can we understand that as some kind of conjuncture moment of a kind of world historical, I mean, I heard parallels in some of your presentations to the sort of Great Depression moment, right? The sort of where something just so seismic and massive happened. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on some of the factors at play in that moment of conjuncture, or how that moment of our world and our lives and our society can invite just maybe a broader discussion of these intersecting crises, right? In that case, we could think literally like histories of housing crises and public health crises, or housing crises and the various issues, Ray brought up, whether policing, immigration, hunger, cost of living more generally. So maybe to speak to this, right, what was at play there And why do we see these sort of escalating trends and terrifying graphs? And then if that, right, sort of, if that doesn't give us enough to talk about these matters of conjuncture and intersecting crises and them having a catalyzing effect.
I mean, I have an answer for that is, very in line with all of the graphs and charts way of thinking that, I laid out in my presentation, where, the pandemic happened, 12 years after the Great Financial Crisis. And if you look at any chart of housing production plummets after the Great Financial Crisis, never really recovers. So we're not adding supply online. At the same time, we have one, like a very large generation of millennials aging into the period when you're going to be ready to buy a home. You also have, I had some of these graphs that I took out of my presentation. You have a lot of people who deferred becoming homeowners for that entire decade following the Great Financial Crisis. So you have pent-up demand for housing. You have all these people aging into housing. Then the pandemic hits. We have these really low interest rates, and we have suddenly the elimination of space as a constraint, right? Everyone's going virtual. You can move wherever you want. And there's also a lot of money flowing through the economy through all of the emergency programs. So this is perfect storm for people who have been saving up to buy a home for maybe a decade. Now they're flush with all this cash, and they say, I'm going to go to the places that are the most affordable, have the best amenities, and so forth. And basically, like, we learned that people can move a lot faster than homes can, or than you can build homes, right? Like, supply is somewhat elastic, but that's like over a period of a decade, maybe. Whereas people were picking up and moving, within a few months of this emergency. So if you look at what happened to rents during 2020, 2021, some of the places that were most expensive in the country, like the Bay Area, rents went down in the immediate period following the pandemic, and they've recovered. They recovered within a few years. So San Francisco is still really expensive, right? There was like maybe 1 or 2 years of affordability. But you look at places like Las Vegas and Phoenix, and I mean, the entire Sun Belt, places that we previously thought of as good bargains, those places saw rents go up by 40%, and they have not gone down. So in 2020, any place that you thought was affordable was a good bargain, in some sense, is no longer a good bargain. All affordability was sucked out of the system. And then all of that emergency money withdrawals from the system. Interest rates go way up. We're in a no hire, no fire economic system. There's no houses for sale. Basically, the entire housing market comes to a halt, but it's frozen at these really, really unaffordable levels that were created by the 2020, 2021 housing market.
There's a question in the chat that I really think we should address. I'm going to respond to the question that was asked, and then I think, Nancy, if you would like to respond too, but we should make time for the question in the chat because that's a good one. Something that I saw as someone who's been part of housing justice movements since 2008, although my family has a long history of bad housing situations, we've been fighting for housing for a long time, 2008 to now, is that in 2020, we saw this very big influx of mass politicization of people around housing rights, tenant rights, and fighting for the right to housing. As I said when I presented, it's one crisis after the next. As soon as there was this understanding that courts could not efficiently operate enough to evict everyone, which is something that happened, courts closed down, eviction proceedings were not happening as quickly as people were worried they were going to be. There was an influx of federal funding to try and keep people housed. Most of it went to landlords, not into the pockets of renters. The next thing that people were concerned about was getting back into the workplace, making sure that conditions of long COVID were being addressed, continuing to have some kind of mutual aid network in place. But that mass influx of politicization has really dampened. It is much more quiet. People have an understanding, but now we're fighting fascism. And we were fighting police brutality in 2020 and 2021 moving forward. Now we're fighting fascism again, World War II denialists, I guess. And I think when that happens, it presents a situation where we do this thing of sort of falling back on policy and saying we need better housing policy, which is true. But in the US, as all of us said today, the issue with housing is very much deeply embedded in racial histories of violence and racism. And right now, as 2020 indicated and moving forward, and the history of housing policy in the US is that housing policy is very post-racial. We have these like this idea of Obama post-racialism. We have very post-racial housing policy. Housing policy doesn't account for race. It doesn't account for indigeneity. And it's not going to, because when you live in a white supremacist society, you can't acknowledge racial superiority, racial supremacy specifically. And I think something that local housing organizers do a good job of, and housing activist movements that are nationally oriented do a good job of, is talking about racialization and housing, the dispossession of housing specifically, and that we actually do have enough housing in this country for everyone. There's something like one homeless person per every 4 vacant homes in the United States. So the idea of housing crisis being supply related is still actually about affordability. It's not about supply. When you commodify housing and all houses, any access to housing is dependent on income, you're going to have some kind of crisis of access. It's not about supply, it's about accessibility. And this sort of mindset that I think is very much based in federal policy right now is that the need for housing is shameful. If you have a need for housing that's beyond your financial capacities, you should feel ashamed. And when you shame people into thinking that they're not deserving of housing, you build up these sort of big thought campaigns like the New York City mayoral election of access to housing is an issue worth fighting against. It's worth fighting for, but it's also worth fighting against. Part of the reason for that is that so much of the city of New York's economy is wrapped up in real estate. And nationally, we're a country that's driven by property, the idea of real property, the idea of private property. So I don't think those things can necessarily, be separated from each other in terms of, well, I've maybe lost my thought. But anyway, when it came to shelter in place orders in 2020, something that housing activists told us around the country is we need people to be able to shelter in place, and there is in fact enough housing. People just can't get inside. And not being able to get inside is the core policy issue that needs to be dealt with, not increasing supply. I thought that was a very powerful sort of moment in housing justice in the last 10 years. And it's something that fell completely short. Anytime you ask for access to something and on the basis of rights, there will be policy that fights against that, banks that fight against that, and people that own those assets that fight against that as well.
Nancy, did you have anything you wanted to add, or should we pivot to the audience question?
We can pivot. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And perhaps to begin to close, discussing very current, very recent events. So this viewer asks, what did the discourse on housing during the New York City mayoral election last week add to the discussion? What did you see as valuable in getting the broader public to understand the housing crisis?
I'll start. I think it's interesting to watch how people are understanding Mamdani as a way to depart pretty radically from the incremental approaches that we've often taken as we think about housing. Like, for instance, we need to remove or fine-tune CEQA so that we can, put in more applications more quickly. So there's sort of like micro level thinking. I think Mamdani blew that kind of thinking out of the water a bit. And, his attitude is, we'll do what it takes, we'll experiment, we'll try different things. And I think that was one of the lessons of that particular election, is that people are looking for that kind of really much broader thinking around housing. Going back to the whole COVID thing, I just think one of the pieces to the housing crisis that we still, I think, as a general public don't talk about enough is the impact of housing equity on long-term multi-generational impact. And the way that I always explain it is, which of my students can afford to take out lower cost loans based on their housing equity? And, we often think of education as the great social mover, but right now I think we're still talking about housing crisis mostly at the political level, at the level of, can we get people into decent shelter?
Anybody else want to weigh in on the question of the recent election in New York and the Mamdani's campaign centering of rent in the campaign?
It's kind of a bank shot because I often hesitate to talk about New York City or Bay Area housing issues. I just consider those to be in parallel universes that don't have to do anything with the other 99% of the United States. But Mamdani talked about affordability in so many different ways. And, people love talking about he talked about the buses, right? And I always think it's important that when we talk about the cost of housing, remember that the cost of housing has capitalized so many other amenities, right? Like access to public education and local violence rates, et cetera. And sometimes I think we can't talk about housing without talking about transportation, right? I mean, we know that land values are way higher next to subway stops, next to interstate exits, et cetera. That's because transportation gives you access to jobs, gives you access to goods and other things. And so when we say housing is too expensive in this area, one solution is, to make more housing in the desirable place where people want to live. The other options are make other places more desirable to live. Whatever amenities that people are trying to buy into there, like good public education. If we had good public education everywhere, people wouldn't pay more to be in a particular school district. You would want to live anywhere, right? If we had buses and subways that linked you to every neighborhood in a metro area, being close to jobs wouldn't be worth so much, right? You could live anywhere and access those jobs and access whatever amenities you want. So, I mean, absolutely, I love housing policy, but I think that in the interest of in the interest of housing affordability, we need to think about transportation. We need to think about public education. We need to think about access to grocery stores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I have one more thing I'd like to add. I was attending NYCHA, so New York Public Housing tenant meetings for a while over the course of the last year, as well as DSA, New York DSA tenant meetings, just able to attend online. The pandemic, right? That's why we're online right now. It's made tenant organizing this really incredible network sort of across the country. But something that I started to pick up on, and Carl, you pointed this out, is that something about Mamdani's campaign is that he's thinking, it's very local to New York, but he's thinking globally in the sense that he's thinking about what do people need holistically in order to afford to live in the city. Housing is definitely one of those things, making sure that people can get on transportation, making sure people have access to basic childcare. The province of Quebec is like Canada's New York. The Quebecois people think about those particular three things all the time, and they're very reproductivist. They're very based in what do people need in order to function in this particular place. The thing about, there's lots of issues with reproductivism. One of the things that is important to think about that Mamdani's campaign pointed out is that it's about making sure people can stay. Can you stay where you want to live? Can you stay where you currently live? Can you stay where you grew up and where you have roots, where you have a community and a sense of belonging? Or are the conditions in that place so hostile toward you because of your race, because of the number of white people that have moved into your neighborhood, because your grocery store that's specific to your culture had to close down because it's too expensive, so on and so forth. Do you no longer feel a sense of belonging here? And I think something that's important about that particular campaign, talking about housing, talking about the ability to work and stay in the neighborhoods you work in, having your kids be able to go to childcare, is can your household, whatever it looks like, kids or no kids, married or not, can you function here the way that you could 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or are you being pushed out? And I think the ability for that campaign to harness this idea of fighting against displacement, using even the language of gentrification, which they did do occasionally, was very powerful because it indicated how many people, as I said a couple minutes ago, were willing to fight that and say, we actually don't want you to have housing. We don't want you to have access to free buses that are faster or childcare. We don't want you here. And the number of people, regardless of what party they were part of, that really catalyzed around that through funding other campaigns, other candidates' campaigns, because that feels like a threat. And it is a threat to have people who are working class or blue collar or lower middle class be able to, coalesce around ideas of affordability and the right to stay somewhere and to have a sense of belonging. When people start to coalesce around a sense of belonging that's based in class politics, that is dangerous. Not for me, not for a lot of people, but it does feel very dangerous. And it's something that other folks demonstrated to us that they thought it needed to be fought against.
And I will say, I mean, your comments make me think of it was surreal in a way to be following the New York election while also following the SEPTA crisis here this summer and fall, right? In the sense of the same conversations it generated about like the ability to live somewhere and get to work, right, becomes the basic, right? These endless case studies where you see how quickly a conversation about housing becomes a conversation about transit, becomes a conversation about, you know, public works.
About
And
heat bills.
yeah, about bill.
How
Yeah.
high is your heat bill?
Yeah. So with an eye on the time, I want to be respectful of you all and our audience, but I just want to make a moment at the end just to, if there's any final things you really want us to know about your work or to leave this conversation with tonight, or if we should end in this moment of a rare moment of forward-looking optimism about innovation, right? And about trying something different. But any last thoughts? Well, with that, I will just offer my gratitude to you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the space, the time.
Yeah, I enjoyed this so much and learned a bunch. And thanks everyone for attending. And we hope you all get home safe and have good evenings.